Today I wanted to talk about the US oligarchy. First question though is about how you were politicized, because you started as a medical student at Harvard. How did you get into politics, and particularly left and progressive politics?
I guess you could say the Vietnam War politicized me way back in the 1960s. I was, standing on a street corner in front of my public library with my high school friends, protesting the war way back when. And that was just an eye-opener that kind of framed my view of the world. That really made me very cynical about the political process. Watching heads get bashed in at the Democratic National Convention in 1968, the protests on campus that I was very much a part of. So I've been very cynical about the political process until I was a social activist for decades, really. And that was partly being a healthcare provider, being a medical doctor, seeing how completely inadequate our healthcare system is to the cause, really being convinced that, health is really in our communities. Ounce of prevention, it's a ton of cure in addressing the community drivers of chronic disease and health injustice and all that. And then being very involved in the communities, trying to clean up our air and our water and make healthy food accessible and affordable, jobs, poverty, kind of becoming immersed in the struggle for the determinants of health, and then seeing that none of that can go forward in our current political system, that the power players have a stranglehold on the system through our government. They are well represented by our political institutions. And then basically I got tricked as a very discouraged activist, watching one issue after the other fail, mobilize, but then fail at the end of the day, watching victory be snatched away from us at the last minute by just tons of money pouring into the very corrupt process of referendums and legislation, watching it always get seized. I was a very discouraged activist, and I got tricked at that point into running for office by people in the Green Party, basically in my home state. I ran for governor, and I discovered, wow, when you're running outside of the box, it's really a great opportunity to reach people and to talk with people. And you can have an honest conversation outside of our very manipulated and fake political system. If you get outside of it, we can really hold important community conversations that respect our humanity and our society and enable us to do some mid-course correcting and community building in the biggest sense of the word. And, that was just a huge discovery. And that kind of came hand in hand with understanding that if we are going to work through the political process, it has to be a different political process, not the one that is owned entirely, bought and paid for by Wall Street and the war machine. And the war machine has really been very central to, my understanding of things since I first became politically aware, and I grew up during the civil rights movement and the Vietnam movement and, the anti-Vietnam movement and the environmental movement and the women's movement, when a lot of that stuff really began to get traction. So that was really kind of where I was grounded. It was like Susan Sarandon always says, well, I didn't change, the world changed around me. I grew up in that generation that really had a very informed, political perspective. And everything I've learned since then just reinforces that. But I guess what's different is that by fighting within the political process, I've really become actually very encouraged at how ready people are how much people are in revolt. They actually are in revolt, very much in revolt. And it's just that the system gets manipulated into silencing and marginalizing, political competition. I used to think that we had to change people's minds. And then after being in the political process and having a lot of public conversations, I realized, no, we don't have to change people's minds. People are ready to go.
Yes, and I think that the best way to operate an oligarchy but give the appearance of democracy is the two-party system, because people feel like they can go out and vote on election day for two different parties that have competing interests and represent different sets of people, when in fact they both operate in the interests of the oligarchy. And you've talked about the war machine and environmental destruction, but how much of that is allowed to happen because we have this two-party system where the oligarchy controls both, the war machine controls both, and people can't choose to vote against this oligarchical system?
Yeah, exactly. It's very much about the two parties, because when you only have two parties, it's a closed system. And when under the conditions of oligarchy, which we are, where wealth and power is concentrated into very few hands, when you have these incredible disparities of power, and then you have a closed system, power can co-opt just two parties. But if you have more than two parties and you have a fluid system, then then the public interest, the greater good, has a fighting chance. So yeah, it's very much about two parties getting bought out, and we see that so much. Over the years. There was a time when the Democratic Party had at least an ounce of integrity that it no longer has. And we've just seen that as money and power becomes more concentrated, as the money pouring into elections goes absolutely off the charts. Between 2016 and 2020, the system actually doubled in the amount of money that was pouring in. You also had the Citizens United decision, which continued an ongoing trend. It didn't actually start it. There were other decisions before that began to undo, campaign finance reforms that had attempted to keep corporations and the wealthy, out of their worst abuses, and provided some control within the system. But it all really went out the window as wealth and power became far more concentrated. And most recently, we've seen how the Department of Treasury actually is acting to shut down our access to public funding right now in real time. This is like a recent development that we've been denied the almost $300,000 in public funds that we have earned. We've earned that match. It was supposed to have been delivered about 2 weeks ago so we could finish our ballot drives. Well, the Department of Treasury conveniently shut down our access to that money. And before that, Congress conveniently, just a couple of months back, Congress conveniently robbed the public finance fund and transferred most of the money out. There's still enough that we could get on the ballot and have a real fight, because things are so extreme right now that people are really, very much chomping at the bit. But money is very powerful, but it's not all determinant. There are just a whole series of repressive strategies that are used by the powers that be in order to silence and effectively disappear their competition. And the fact that they are so focused on doing that now, that they're really pulling out all the stops, is actually, I think, a really good sign about how scared they are and how close we are to a tipping point right now.
And I just wanted to ask now about the fear tactics used by the two main parties in the United States against people like yourself, the Green parties and other alternative parties, which is that by standing against the Democrats, you pull votes away from them and allow in potentially Donald Trump or potentially fascism or whatever it is. They always use that argument to say, don't vote for the Greens, don't vote for any other alternative parties, vote for the Democrats to keep out people like Donald Trump. Can you address that argument? Is there any truth to it? And are you helping to usher in fascism effectively? Because the argument is always buttressed by this example from 2000 when the Green Party under Ralph Nader pulled votes away from Al Gore and that helped George W. Bush get into the White House, and then all the attendant horrors that happened after that. So can you just address that argument? Is there any validity to it?
It is BS, and it's complete BS. And this is the effort of the predator state to basically disempower its opposition. There's nothing more powerful than the propaganda war, and telling people that they need to be hopeless because they're powerless. If you think you're powerless, you are powerless. But in the words of Alice Walker, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. And there's so much evidence to show that we do have power. But let me just speak to the issue itself. First of all, anybody who tells you that they own your vote, that they don't have to earn your vote, well, they don't deserve even consideration for your vote, because in fact, we own our votes. That is our power in a democracy. That is the democratic force in democracy, is that we voters own our votes, and we only give our votes where they're earned. Nobody's entitled to them. They have to earn them. And if people don't see that, we basically give up our power. And if you simply vote for the lesser evil, you disappear your power. If we're not voting against the war, if we don't have an anti-war, anti-genocide candidate in the fight, how does anyone ever know that there are anti-war, anti-genocide voters out there? They don't know. We have to fight. So they invent all kinds of, bogus narratives to try to talk people out of their power. And let me give two really key facts. One is that polls show that third parties, our campaign in particular, we don't really draw from Democrats. We draw from people who otherwise won't vote. They've already been persuaded that there's nothing to vote for in the Democratic and Republican parties, that it's not to their advantage. So we give people a reason to come back into the process and to vote. We're mostly drawing from the not voting bucket. And then if you look back over recent history to see where was the most spoiled election for the Democrats, it was actually 2010, when the Democrats lost 1,000 seats in state legislatures. They lost 64 seats in Congress, 12 or 13 seats in the Senate, and 12 or 13 governorships. It was just a blanket wipeout. Were there third parties to blame it on? No. What happened was the Democratic trifecta, that is a Democratic House, Senate, and the White House under Barack Obama, bailed out Wall Street. They bailed out the crooks on Wall Street and threw out, 7, 8, 9 million homeowners instead, and allowed also students to be basically trapped in lifelong student debt. Could have bailed them out and could have ever since, but no, instead they chose to bail out the crooks on Wall Street. So 2010 was the first chance to hold them accountable, and they were held accountable. The Democrats have betrayed their base. So they have spoiled the elections for themselves, and then they conveniently try to find people to blame it on. But it's actually not true that we are taking votes away. Elections are not a closed system. The biggest factor in elections is actually who's going to vote. And that's where we come into play in bringing more people out to vote. So it's just not true that we take votes away. And allowing yourself to be talked into that is like being in an abusive relationship where people are forever making excuses for their abuser. Oh, he didn't mean it. He didn't mean to beat me up. He'll be nicer next year. It was just that he was drinking too much. Whatever the issue is, people make excuses and find ways to put up with their own destruction. And it's like gaining your power to cut your ties in an abusive relationship and get your life back. And that's basically what it's about, so that's what we say to people. It's not going to get better unless you make it get better. We are the agents here. We are the ones we've been waiting for, simply trying to figure out which one is the greater evil or which one is the lesser evil. It's just not very convincing these days. We have essentially two greater evil candidates. And, even if you thought there was a lesser evil, in fact, it's time to forget the lesser evil and fight for the greater good, because that strategy of voting for the lesser evil is just delivering all the evil that we've been afraid of. We need to voting systems and democracy needs a vision forward. It needs a moral compass. It needs to say where we have to go. It just can't say who we hate the most. Simply voting based on who you hate the most or who you fear the most is not a system for moving us forward or making things better. We have to stand up and, really take charge of our future, because if we don't do it, no one will.
And how robust do you think the two-party system is now? Because you've seen recent elections around the world, particularly in the UK actually, where you've had new parties that were created maybe months before the election winning 3-4 seats in the House of Commons. Are you more hopeful than ever for the chances of the Green Party at the next election and going into the future? And do you think this is an opportunity to smash the two-party system that you're saying enforces oligarchy?
Exactly. I mean, it's ironic that these are kind of the most dire of times, and the need for, for big change has never been more urgent. But at the same time, that transformational change has never loomed so large. And the two kind of go together. It's like the Chinese saying that that crisis and opportunity go hand in hand. And we are kind of in the ultimate crisis right now, whatever dimension of our lives you want to look at, whether it's healthcare or crushing inequality, the impending death of the oceans, the collapse of the climate, the drift towards nuclear war and nuclear engagement on several fronts now. We're in pretty dire circumstances right now. And, if you look at polls of young people right now, 50% of young people describe themselves as hopeless about the future. 1/4 of young people have contemplated harming themselves within the past 2 weeks. And, what a statement that is about the really abysmal state of society across the board. So it's that sense of desperation that has really opened up all kinds of possibilities. And I do want to note, as you've mentioned, the recent elections in the UK, we also have what's going on in France now, which is also really interesting. And it's, from the 20,000 feet here, it really illustrates how the neoliberal parties across the world really have betrayed working people with their austerity, with their massive tax giveaways to the wealthy, with their privatization of our commons and our public resources and the destruction of the environment. That really is the death of so-called liberalism and these centrist parties that really are not left parties. They pretend to be. They're absolutely not. They hijack some of the language, but that's about it. That really has generated the reaction on the right. It's people who were deprived of Bernie Sanders that then many of them went to vote for Donald Trump. And nobody initially was voting for Trump. They were voting against the legacy of the Democrats and Hillary Clinton. That's where, the right wing has mostly, or the extreme right wing has very much originated from the abuses of a neoliberalism. So neoliberalism has really given rise to neo-fascism and these parties of the extreme right. And it's very interesting now that it is the true left, as opposed to these neoliberals. It's the true left, which has proven itself in France of actually standing up and, and taking back this potential for our democracy. And boy, do we need to emulate that in this country.
Now, the Democrats have always been in favor and representatives of the US imperial system. And in fact, their politicians would not even admit that a US empire exists. So I wanted to ask, what are the Green Party policies to end the US empire?
So the US Green Party is very clear about this and is, very much focused on ending the US empire and on basically dismantling empire so that we can move from this effort to enforce a unipolar world, a world dominated by the US empire. We need to move into, from being the bully in the schoolyard to being a team player in a global community, a multipolar community. And the Greens are all about that and are very much opposed to the wars of empire and the whole structure of empire, that it's really impossible. For Greens, this is a central core issue. It's impossible to address all the other issues, the war on democracy here at home, the the glaring crisis of healthcare, housing, education, and the environment. When the endless war machine is consuming half of our congressional budget, the dollars are not there to have a world that's working for us. It's just working really for war contractors are the only ones, and their political handmaidens really are the only ones that this is working for right now. It's really destroying the world and our prospects for a survivable future. So the Greens are very much focused on this. Now, that's not to say that Greens all over the world are, and the German Greens have been notorious warmongers and not just participants, but leaders in the abuses of empire. So it's very interesting to see the kind of dynamics going on now in Europe, viewed from across the pond, but still, this is a very active engagement. And I will say that US Greens used to be very much going solo among the global Greens, but we're seeing that change now, and we're seeing many other Green parties get with the program, particularly in Australia. The Canadian Greens are split right now, but there's a very strong anti-imperial movement within the Canadian Greens as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the connections between the American empire and the environmental crisis? Because the Pentagon is the largest institutional emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. It seems to me you can't combat the climate crisis without combating the Pentagon, which is obviously the enforcement arm of the US empire. So can you talk about that connection and what the Green Party will do to stop US contributing to the environmental crisis?
Yeah, so as you said, the Pentagon and the US war machine is a major contributor to climate change. Among the world's 190 some nations, if the Pentagon was a nation, it ranks somewhere around 40. I don't recall the number exactly, but it's fairly up there among contributors to climate change. And it's not just the climate that war is destroying. I mean, war is also destroying ecosystems and marine life and ocean mammals, and is just wreaking havoc on our water systems, spewing pollution, depleted uranium, for example, on landscapes all around the world, using incredibly toxic chemicals. The PFAS epidemic, for example, the PFAS destruction of our water supplies is very much being driven by military bases who are polluting the aquifers beneath them and the water supplies adjacent to them. So, militarism and war is just not compatible with life and the future on all counts. And, the climate is one dimension that's really blowing up on us right now in a very big way. So, yeah, there are many ways in which we will not survive on our current militaristic trajectory. We need, the solution here is not to green the military, it's not to convert, our military to renewable energy. The solution here is to basically massively downsize the US military, which is, bigger than the next 10 militaries combined. So this is the heart of the problem here, but we need to scale back on conflict all around the world, and obviously scale back our bases, our military budget, our weapons, nuclear and otherwise. And we need to transition from a foreign policy based on war and conflict to a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy. There's no way around it. That's what we have to do.
And one of the major ways that the US enforces its will around the world is these military bases. There's 800 of them that we know about. Would you get rid of the 800 or so US military bases around the world if you got into power?
Most of them, absolutely. Yes. I mean, there may be an exception here and there, but for the most part, we should not be in the business of having weapons depots all around the world, which is basically what they are. Why do we want weapons depots all around the world? For the same reason that, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense described Israel as the unsinkable battleship for the US in the Middle East. Why? To control the Middle East oil supply, So this is all about controlling resources and power and markets around the world. And we cannot be in the business of controlling the world. Not only that it breeds horrific, disastrous conflict, which will end it all for all of us, but also because we are no longer the dominant economic player. And by trying to be the dominant military player when we're not even the dominant economic player is absolutely hopeless. So it's just nuts that our current generation of misleaders is taking us in such an absolutely wrong-headed and self-destructive and globally destructive foreign policy.
Thanks. And I just want to move on now to the conflict in Gaza, because it's had a huge impact around the world, politically, socially, culturally. And in the United States, it's really exposed the two-party system you've been talking about, because the genocidaire in chief is Joe Biden, who's a Democrat. And if Trump wins the election, it's going to be even worse. So people can't vote against the genocide. So it's exposed the American empire, it's exposed the bipartisan nature of the American empire. Can you talk a little bit about the impact it's had on you personally, watching the genocide unfold over the last 10 months, and what significance you think it has for the US political system going forward?
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, Gaza is kind of a microcosm of what's wrong with empire. We can stop the genocide simply by the president making a phone call. The genocide is over and the war is over. This is simple. But the larger issue of the US, attempting to control oil in the Middle East and the US relationship with Israel and Israel's relationship with Gaza, this is deep stuff. And in that sense, this is kind of a microcosm of empire and this notion that the US has to really control dynamics around the world. So it's like a mask off moment. And it's a mask off moment in the most horrifying way imaginable, watching children and women and elders and all the vulnerable just be tortured, systematically tortured on an industrial scale, and tortured and murdered. It's just jaw-dropping, and it's hard for anything else to compete with it in terms of just drama and kind of wrenching human emotions. This is such a big thing, and it is so revealing about what is wrong with the US approach to power right now. So in that sense, it's absolutely riveting. It's very riveting to me as a Jew, because I grew up after the Holocaust. I grew up just after the Second World War in a Jewish community, attending a synagogue, and very much grappling along with my generation with how do we ever come to terms with the genocide against anybody, but against your own, religion or your own ethnic group. It's a challenging moment. And for myself, as well as a lot of Jews in my generation, how we came to terms with that was by resolving that we would never allow genocide to happen again. And I grew up with the understanding that not only is it absolutely dreadful for anyone to perpetrate genocide, but it's also dreadful for anybody to be a bystander to genocide. That's really what I was taught. That was the solution, was that bystanders could no longer stand by going on into the future. So that meant that genocide wasn't okay for anybody, not just Jews, but genocide against anyone is not okay. And for me, that was just like a central core of how I grew up and made sense out of the world. And so it's really, kind of intolerable to me that kind of basic guideline for how the world works, that is being torn to shreds. And I cannot be a bystander to genocide. And, how it's affected me personally, it's just really made me double down in my resistance to empire. And things that might have been otherwise discouraging are not discouraging at all, because it's in the context of a genocide. And this is like absolutely not okay. And it makes our struggles look so trivial compared to what, the people of Palestine are enduring now. So, it is a moment, I think, of, it's kind of a come to Jesus moment about who are we? Who are we anyhow? And what will we allow to be done to our fellow human beings? So for me, it's a very mobilizing moment. And I think politically, it is a huge wake-up moment, and it really does spell the end of empire. The fact that not only that the empire is doing this, is a full participant in the genocide, but also, that the empire is capable of looking away. To me, it is so revealing that some, our leadership in particular, and all of Congress practically, they are perfectly capable of turning their heads here. And it's just such a mask off moment for, how dreadful this empire is and how much it needs to be put behind us.
As you said, Joe Biden could end this genocide tomorrow with one phone call. So what would the Green Party do if you became president to stop Israeli attacks on Palestinians and to resolve the conflict?
Exactly. So first step would be that phone call. Second step, would be to curtail all shipments of weapons and all military support for Israel until Israel comes into compliance with international law. So it's and human rights. So it's not only that the genocide has to stop, but the occupation also has to stop, and the ethnic cleansing and the apartheid state has to basically come to an end. So that would be essential. And to get there, I think the US is in control here, and the US can make this happen. So, and I think the world community has enormous potential here to ensure that this happens. Israel has nuclear weapons, so you can't just tell them what to do. However, the world has enormous potential here to influence Israel's decision, both by way of economic boycotts, military boycotts, and so on. But Israel is surrounded by neighbors who are being really mobilized against it, and Israel's peace agreements with both Egypt and Jordan are very much being tested right now, particularly by the people of those countries, especially in Jordan, where there are very large demonstrations taking place against Israel now, calling for an end to the treaty with Israel. For Israel now to be engaging in hostilities with Hezbollah and threatening to use a nuclear weapon to bomb Lebanon back to the Stone Age. This is really mobilizing Israel's neighbors against it. So Israel is very much in the target hairs itself, as really are all people in the Middle East, because if this proceeds to the use of a nuclear weapon, this could be unbelievably dangerous. Israel has nuclear weapons, and if Iran is brought in here, which it very well could be in its alliance with Hezbollah, well, that brings in Russia, because Russia is also in an alliance with Iran. So there could be a lot of nuclear weapons flying free here, and it doesn't take that many nuclear weapons to basically bring on nuclear winter. So people who think that a nuclear war can happen over there are absolutely wrong. And that a lot of that is our leadership that is absolutely clueless and reckless and doesn't understand the very grave dangers to everyone from any use of nuclear weapons whatsoever. A single nuclear armed submarine contains the equivalent of 5,000 Hiroshima bombs, and we have 14 such nuclear armed submarines. So even a fraction of one nuclear submarine is enough to put us into nuclear winter, all of us. And we all go the way of the dinosaurs when that happens. So nuclear weapons very much need to be banned, as the global community has banned them, and the US needs to get with the program here and help promote this ban on nuclear weapons, especially among the nuclear countries. But what's happening right now is the exact opposite of that. And you see NATO, for example, threatening to take its nuclear weapons out of storage now because of this incredible escalation going on at the border of Russia in this proxy war taking place in Ukraine. So, this is a very dangerous situation that we can fix if only we had a government that was working for us and not for the weapons industry.
It's interesting that you're the only major leader of a political party that is talking about peace. If you were elected president, what would you do about US military aid to Ukraine, which has been huge since the Russian invasion of 2022?
Great. Okay. So the war in Ukraine never should have happened. It didn't start, in February or whatever it was of 2022. This was just the latest phase of a conflict that can be traced back at least to 2014 to the US supported coup in the Maidan, where a democratically elected government was overthrown. Yeah, it was corrupt, but so is the one that we have right now that we're supporting. That was not the position of the US and Victoria Nuland, whose phone conversation was leaked, showing how she was basically orchestrating who the next leaders would be in Ukraine. This war did not need to happen. It was well known from from the time that the promise was made to Gorbachev that NATO would not advance to the east, not 1 inch to the east of Germany, if Germany was allowed to reunite and join NATO, that the conditions were that the US and NATO would not continue marching to Russia's border, Russia, who had just lost 27 million people due to invasion over the Ukraine border. So it's inexcusable that this war is happening at all. It was absolutely understood what it would mean to basically weaponize Ukraine's border with Russia. And NATO has basically established nuclear compatible missiles already at many sites on Russia's border. So it's no surprise that Russia is touchy about its border, as we were touchy in the Cuban Missile Crisis when we had our nuclear weapons in the air, launched and ready to use. Russia is basically in the inverse position right now. So, our whole approach to this has been extremely provocative and wrong-headed. And Russia has offered over and over to basically cease and desist. From long before the war started, Russia simply wanted neutrality for Ukraine, like Austria was neutral after the Second World War. So this was like an absolute no-brainer. And it was very clear that Russia would not back off on this in the same way that the US wasn't going to back off about nuclear missiles in Cuba. Russia's not going to back off. There are not critical US interests that are being defended here, but they are for Russia. So it's nuts for us to have armed Ukraine and encouraged this conflict, basically to bleed out Russia's resources. And, our Secretary of Defense and others have been actually very honest about what this war is about. This is about bleeding down Russia to the last Ukrainian. And, it's an absolute tragedy for the people of Ukraine that they're being used in this proxy war, basically. A proxy war which cannot win. So in the long and the short of it is, yes, we would stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. We would also stop disrupting the peace process, which is what the US has done here over and over again, from before the start of the war to after the war, when there was a treaty that was basically all but concluded, negotiated under the auspices of Turkey, that showed Putin is not a threat. Putin wants security, like any country wants security, and doesn't want nukes on their border. And Putin has showed that over and over by being willing to negotiate treaties and to Putin did not want to acquire the eastern provinces of Ukraine where Russian-speaking people live. It was the demand from those provinces that they wanted to leave Ukraine and wanted the protection of Russia because they were losing thousands of people in this chronic warfare with Kyiv against the eastern provinces. So there is there's a ready-made solution here. This is not about unleashing some imperial power. Russia is not the Soviet Union and has, taken steps to secure its border, but nothing beyond that. I mean, and what are we comparing Russia to? The US, which has orchestrated some 70 regime change operations and has bases in practically all countries around the world. And according to the Brown Cost of War project at Brown University, we currently have so-called anti-terror operations now, which are active in 85 countries around the world. So if we want to talk about, countries with global scope and a global empire, we epitomize that. And Russia's foreign policy is extremely, is peanuts compared to the kinds of interference that the US routinely takes in global affairs. So Russia is not the issue here.
Yeah, I mean, polls of the global population show that most people think the US is the main danger to world peace. If you were elected president as the Green Party candidate, would you withdraw the United States from NATO?
I don't think the US belongs in NATO. I think Europe deserves its own security architecture, which should be integrated into an economic and diplomatic architecture. To have strictly a freestanding military organization is nuts. It's not good for Europe. It's not good for the United States, and it's not good for the world. I mean, look, NATO is going way beyond the North Atlantic, in its role in Afghanistan, for example, or Libya. NATO is being dragged all over the world here as a ruse, really, to give diplomatic cover to the US when the US violates international law and sidelines the UN process and, for governing international relations. So NATO is just a cover, and it's a great marketing strategy for US, war profiteers, because countries who join NATO are obliged basically to buy US weapons. So it is a ripoff for us all. And, the entire apparatus of the US war expenses and the Pentagon, of which NATO is a subset for us, that is robbing us blind. It's usurping half of our congressional budget. It's cost the average American household about $12,000 this year and about $55,000 per household since the post 9/11 wars began. And what do we have to show for it? Failed states, mass refugee migrations, ongoing terrorist threats, just an absolute mess. And the US is completely losing respect and our status among nations. So this is a completely counterproductive, very dangerous, downright suicidal set of policies that badly need to be changed. And NATO is a major part of that.
There's a lot of propaganda about NATO, though, so not many people know the reality of what it does around the world, as you're describing. Julian Assange has just been released from Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in London, while Edward Snowden is living in exile in Russia. He can't come back to the United States. Can you just talk about the significance of what those two men did? And also, if you were elected president, would you pardon them for the offenses that the United States government has charged them with?
So what they did basically was, fight for our democracy, and, Assange for freedom of the press, which is basically freedom of speech. These are our First Amendment rights. And Snowden basically is fighting for our right to privacy. So they have been patriots in the highest sense of the word. And they've done an absolutely immeasurable service to our country and to our democracy, which is otherwise on life support. I would not only exonerate the both of them, I would also compensate them for, for the years of their lives that have been stolen from them, especially Julian Assange. And I would invite them into our cabinet, to tell you the truth, because we need them and their insight and their vision for how do we, recover our democracy. They're both, incredibly brilliant and principled, inspirational people, and they would absolutely be welcomed into whatever corner of the White House they want to occupy, for sure.
Well, it's a nice thought to think of Julian Assange and Edward Snowden working inside the White House. I can't quite imagine it, but let's hope it happens. I wanted to end by asking about your feelings of hope for change and for a better future. Because the world, if you look at it, is an awful place at the moment. There's war, there's inequality, there's poverty everywhere. But there's also a feeling that things are going to change. We don't know how they're going to change, but there's a revolutionary fervor at the moment. Are you hopeful for the future? And if you are, what do you put that hope down to?
I'm someone who doesn't really believe in hope. I don't believe in hope as a tool, because hope doesn't get us there. I believe in power, and I believe in building power. And so, yeah, I guess I'm sort of emotionally hopeful, because I feel really the clear and present possibility of transformational change. Not only possibility, but inevitability. It's really inevitable. Things are going to change, and it's not rocket science how we get them to change in the right direction. You like looking at France, for example, again, as another case in point, it's by laying out actual solutions that change the material conditions of people's lives. That's what the parties of the left are doing, and the Greens are doing in France. That's what the right could not do. The right wing can't do that. They can kind of grab headlines by finger pointing and by scapegoating and pretending this is the fault of immigrants or the fault of the LGBTQ plus community. They can grab headlines doing that, but they can't really change the quality of people's lives. So they don't have staying power either, which is another thing on our side. And just by having sort of witnessed the course of history for my many decades, you just see over and over again how the arc of the universe does bend towards justice. And it bends faster if we stand up and make it bend. And just given the internet, actually, and social media, though it's very compromised and under attack, but we have a certain perspective now that we didn't. I think we have kind of a collective memory now, in large measure, through resources on the internet, and you have to sort through them, but it's not impossible to do that. We have a much better basis for a strategy going forward, and it's not rocket science about how we do this. It's politics 101, basically. This is about phone banking, it's about door knocking, it's about networking with our neighbors, it's about tabling at events and having conversations, and then holding our so-called leaders accountable and throwing the bums out, because most of them should be thrown out for absolutely betraying us in both of the sold out corporate political parties. So yes, I do feel, I would say, not hopeful in that it's not been like drummed up out of nowhere, out of thin air, but I feel incredible possibility right now that things are going to change, and we know enough now, and we have enough of an infrastructure and a running start here and examples of success that we can drive this in a direction that will create an America and a world that more or less works for all of us. And that's what we need. I heard Buckminster Fuller actually say this in the 1970s, that the world had gotten to a place where it's all of us or none of us, and the time is now. And that made so much sense to me back then, and all the more now. So, it feels like the time is here. We need to get organized. And I encourage people, to go to our website, jillstein2024.com, and, being a part of this fight, because if we own this and we work together, we are unstoppable.